So this video is for those of you who maybe were absent on the day I lectured around this. But the new unit we're going to be starting is imperialism. One of the first things we always talk about is how did imperialism connect to the previous unit, or another way of putting it is how did the previous unit kind of set the stage for something like imperialism to occur. So in this case, we're talking about the Industrial Revolution or technology. And if you remember that a lot of different machines were starting to be developed, and so people were producing a lot more products and goods, textiles, clothing, those kinds of things. And with the use of machines, they were able to kind of change over their nation's economies. Their economies were once built on farming, and people basically just grew food and tried to survive. But now that they have machines, they're able to produce a lot more, so now they can start to focus on other goods and products and things that they can sell to other people and start to make a lot of money. Well, what you need in order for your economy to continue to grow is you need natural resources. You need labor, you need money, all those kinds of things in order to continue to have your economy grow. But if you're a small nation in Europe, you only have so many natural resources within the borders of your country, right? Your country is a certain size and there's only so many things that it has within it. So if you need additional resources, you're going to have to go out and go get them. And that's really what imperialism is. So when we look at imperialism, it's really about a huge consumption of raw materials. And so in order to get those things, we need to go out and find the materials to fuel that industrial revolution within your own country. And so this is about nations going out to neighboring areas, maybe the next continent over, maybe even trying to conquer the next nation over next to them. But doing that so that way they could get access to their natural resources and use them back at home to kind of fuel their industrial revolution back at home and make a lot more money. So when you talk about these different kinds of things, one of the big things created back in the day, and we're talking the mid 1800s, something like that, is really when the Industrial Revolution was in full force, is people were producing textiles or cloth, right? They need it for clothing, they need it for bedding, all kinds of things like that. So one of the things you need for that is cotton. Well, cotton doesn't grow everywhere. And so if you need cotton, you're going to have to go to places where cotton does grow. And you had places like the Americas. We grew a lot of cotton here in the colonies here in the Americas, and that's why some nations went down and colonized places here in the United States. They kind of set up the United States. Egypt is also another one of those places in kind of the northern part of Africa because of the Nile River and the amount of water flowing and flooding on a yearly basis. It creates good soil, and the climate is such that you get some of the best cotton in the world. And so it's still today known as one of the regions with the best cotton around. And so you've got that. And so, but you need to go out and get these natural resources so that way you can bring them back to your factories and continue to provide the resources they need to produce whatever goods and services it is that you need to produce. Steel was also another thing starting to come into play in a major way during the Industrial Revolution. And so if you didn't have the iron ore and different metals that you need to make steel, you would have to go find those. Well, Africa had a lot of the different kinds of iron ores and things that you needed in order to produce the steel to help fuel your Industrial Revolution back at home in Europe. And so to produce cars and railroads and trains and steam engines and all those kinds of things, you needed steel. And so you needed to go find those in certain places, right? This was also the time when we were starting to develop cities that were kind of developed around these new factories that were popping up on these waterways. And one of the things they did was start to build large buildings or, multiple story buildings. And they used steel to do that. So going out and getting the iron ore and things that you needed to build these buildings and the rest of the infrastructure was very, very important for nations to continue to grow. There's an era known as the Scramble for Africa. And this was sort of the late 1800s to the early 1900s. And this is when the Europeans really looked kind of south down into the continent of Africa and the different resources that were there as a way to fuel their industrial revolutions back at home in Europe. And so a lot of these nations started to race down to Africa to go colonize and take over those different regions so they would have access to those natural resources. So this map here shows kind of before the scramble for Africa, kind of where the different empires were by the native tribes down in Africa themselves. And you can see there's a lot of kind of open space in places, and these empires were a little bit smaller. They hadn't really taken advantage yet of industrialization, and so you had just small kingdoms based on different tribal, tribal relationships and things like that. By 1914, here's what Africa kind of looked like from a political map, meaning that here are the different regions that were colonized by the Europeans within the span of about 30 years is all. And so you can see the British had lots of areas that they had colonized, the French had colonized all of basically the northwestern part of Africa, and you got a lot of different countries kind of in here. What is kind of interesting to notice is Spain only had a small, tiny little chunk, but if you think about where Spain colonized, they really colonized the Americas, right? Spain had taken over basically all of South America and Mexico and all of the western part of the North America, which is now the United States. And so they didn't really need a lot of colonies here in Africa. They had colonies in other parts of the world. And so you can kind of see what's going on here. One of the things you run into when you have all these European nations kind of racing down to Africa to go grab a chunk of land for themselves and get these natural resources which are vital to them, is you might start running into some problems, right? Because when you go and colonize, you're sending your military troops down there to go forcibly take over these areas from the native Africans that were already living there. And one of the things that the European nations were worried about was the idea that because they're competing so hard with one another to get these resources, that they might actually come into conflict with one another. And the worst case scenario would be that they start a war amongst themselves. So they literally got together in Berlin and brought the leaders of the different nations together and said, look, we're competing. This is a bit of a dangerous situation here. We don't want to go to war. So why don't we just divide up Africa ourselves so that way we can have some general rules to play by and we might avoid war ourselves. So they literally sat around and kind of divided up Africa for themselves with very little consideration, I might point out, to the natives that are already living in Africa and how they might feel about being conquered in. So then that brings us to the idea of, well, what gives them the motivation to go down and do this? We've talked obviously about kind of an economic motivation where they can fuel their industrial revolutions and make money, but there were other motivations as well to go down and start to colonize in places like Africa. So we'll talk about those right now. But we also don't want to forget that other parts of the world were colonized also. And so the British had taken over India. Obviously we talked already about Spain taking over the Americas, and the French were down in the Americas as well, and other countries. But they were, the colonizing in different parts of the world. So the different motives to imperialism as they raced down to Africa obviously was economic, right? There was a desire to make money. Expand and control foreign trade as they went around different trade routes. They needed ports and things like that. One of the things you get from that also is if you are down there taking their natural resources, shipping those back to your home country in Europe, producing clothing or whatever goods you're producing, you need to sell those to somebody. Well, you only have so many people in your home country, so what you can then do is start to sell those products back to your colonies in other parts of the world, and it opens up new markets that way, and you have new customers, and you can sell a lot more, and that's a good thing, right? So obviously you want those raw materials, and then you're also getting forms of cheap labor. You need somebody to work these fields, produce these natural resources, dig in the mines, all those kinds of things. Well, the people that you've conquered in will do those kinds of work for you for a very cheap amount of money. And so you can actually make a heck of a lot more that way. So this here is just a picture of a diamond mine here in South Africa. You've got the natives that were forced to work in these diamond mines. You have kind of the colonists. You can see that they're white here, making sure that the slaves are working basically in these mines for them to produce the natural resources that they're looking for. One of the other big products was nuts, and so you have to have labor. To do that, you use the natives once again to create that labor or that cheap labor for you, and then you take all of these, load them up on ships, and send them back to Europe, and you can sell them in Europe and other parts of the world and make money doing that. Another thing that, or another motivation that these European nations had was a political motivation, right? Because if you look around in Europe and you see all of your neighbors racing down to Africa, grabbing colonies, getting all these natural resources, being able to develop their economies and build bigger and stronger things. One of the fears is that if you don't do the same as well, then you're going to fall behind them. You're going to become a weaker nation compared to them, and the threat becomes that they might have eventually invade you and conquer your country. So in order to keep up with everybody else and develop your own industrial revolution and keep that going, you've got to go out and do the same thing. So you need to expand your territory just basically so you can compete with other European nations and gain power for yourself as well. And that's really where we get that idea of that scramble for Africa. You can kind of see all these different European countries tugging on Africa, trying to get a piece of their own colony or whatever it might be down there to get natural resources to help them become a strong nation as well. Another motivation was a bit religious. There were a lot of the religious churches and church leaders were tied in with the political leaders, the kings and the presidents of these different nations. And so one of the ways that churches get strong is by having large memberships, right, and converting people to their religion. Because if the more members you have more people who are going to donate money to your church, which means you have more money for your church and that kind of thing. So, religion kind of tagged onto that and felt that they could go and convert as many people as they could to their particular religion, which meant they had more members, which meant more members were going to donate money and that church would become wealthier. This you can see is a picture of a Sunday school, a Methodist or Protestant Christian church in Angola. And so you can see all the native kids were required to go to this church, and you have kind of a white priest who's leading them in this. But this is a way that you convert people away from their old religions to the new religions, in this case Christianity. But people were required to do that because they had been colonized in, and they were bringing Christianity to Africa. Another motivation, and this is a bit unfortunate, is what we'll term ideological. But this really is referring to the belief that certain cultural values are superior to others. And unfortunately, a lot of this is based on the color of your skin. And so these white European nations really felt like they were superior to a lot of these different African nations that seemed a lot more primitive, uncivilized. And so, and there was a bit of an idea of, the strongest nation survive, kind of the survival of the fittest. And if you had the better tools, better weaponry, better, you're a little bit more advanced, and you could go down and conquer somebody, why wouldn't you do that? And so there was kind of an idea that we are superior to you because we're white, because we have advanced technology, and therefore your stuff is free for the taking for us as long as we can do that. This here is an advertisement for soap, and you can kind of see the simple belief in white superiority in this, and everything about this is cleaning somebody's skin in order to lighten it, because that's what you want to do in order to bring civilization to others and lift them out of their kind of primitive ways. And so you can see here the first step towards lightening the white man's burden, which was hey, we're superior to you, so we have a burden or kind of an obligation to go out and bring civilization to these uncivilized parts of the world, is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness. Pear soap, right, is a positive factor in brightening the dark corners of the earth, right? And so there's all this pretty straightforward wording about being dark is not good and we should lighten things up because they believe that white people were superior to dark-skinned people. Right here in Burma, you can see you've got the one white woman. She's instructing all the other women what civilized women did and how they're supposed to dress and act, even in their own country. So abandon your own cultural ideas and you better become white like the rest of us. And then there were some people that really wanted to just go out and explore, right? And you know, for the sake of exploring, they had that adventuresome attitude. They really wanted to do that. Maybe find some new medicines or plants or herbs that were not in Europe but could have some medicinal purposes, things like that. This map just kind of shows kind of the unexplored territories and how some people really wanted to go figure out what was kind of going on in some of those different areas. So that gives you a general idea of how things, you know, how imperialism or going out and colonizing connects to the Industrial Revolution. They wanted those resources, and then some of the different motivations that were behind why they felt they should be able to go out and conquer native people and their native lands and take those things for themselves. So there you go.